Newscast.
Newscast from the BBC.
Hello, it's Paddy in the studio.
And it's Laura in the newsroom in lovely Liverpool.
Why are you there, he asks.
I am here because the Labour Party conference is just getting going, which should be, for the Labour Party, newly into government after 14 years in the wilderness, a massive victory lap with lots of hugging and cheering and being genuinely delighted about being in government. However, they have had a very, very difficult week, and there are lots of people really worried and wondering what my goodness is going on.
Could we say that there wasn't really a honeymoon and that actually they're gathering in conference with the main message being distracted from by some unforced errors?
We can absolutely say that without doubt. We can say that Labour has ended up with a messy problem about donations to them of freebies, of clothes, of football tickets, of all sorts of other things, of holiday accommodation in Manhattan, of all places. And these are not things that anybody made them do. They're completely separate to what the government genuinely talks about, the big problems that they want to fix in the country, whether that's infrastructure or housing or those big things that make a difference to people's lives. But they have ended up with a pretty unsavoury row over money that they've been taking and declaring, we should say very clearly, rules haven't been broken. But it does, for many members of the public, have a very nasty whiff about it. And having stood by what had gone on all week, Keir Starmer defended it in interview after interview after interview. But then late on Friday, suddenly came the announcement, and I think because there was more coming out in the newspapers, that Angela Rayner, Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves, who it emerged had also taken thousands of pounds worth of donations in clothes, would not be accepting any more free clothes. Labour hopes as the conference begins that the sun is coming out, and they hope that the conference will sweep away all of this embarrassment, but I'm not so sure that's true.
Well, it's been a very fast-moving week because even I stumbled onto a political interview of interest when Harriet Harman came before me on Newsnight saying that the Labour leader, the Prime Minister, will not take free gifts in the future. She wasn't saying to me should not. She was announcing, as a former acting leader, as a fact, she was briefly leader, you ought to put me right, I'm sure.
She was, yeah.
He will not. It sounded like the grandees, the people who remembered 97, were coming in and giving them a stiff talking to in the bike shed. And guess what happened the next day? He said, we're not going to take any more freebies.
But this is where I think the problem comes in, because Keir Starmer's hoping to draw a line with that announcement late last night. Well, it was late in the day last night rather than in midnight. I made it sound like it was very exciting. Somehow at 11 p.m. it suddenly was snuck out. They've said they're not going to take any more free clothes. And only 3 of the cabinet are not going to take any more free clothes. They've said nothing about football tickets in his corporate box at Arsenal. They've said nothing about holiday accommodation. They've said nothing about donations of other things, tickets to Taylor Swift. What about Oasis tickets that are going to be pretty hard to get hold of this year? So they've done a partial, here's a new rule that we're going to stick to, but there's still all sorts of loopholes, and it's going to be interesting to see how that develops in the next few days, because it's not that coherent to say we won't take these things but we'll still take all of these, and also to just say, oh, these 3 people at the top of government won't take any more clothes, but what about everything else? So I still think this is unfinished business, not least because it's quite clear that a lot of members of the public take an incredibly dim view of this. Do you remember on Sunday when we had David Lammy on the show, Paddy, and I read out an email from a viewer who'd got in touch apoplectic at this had gone on and just furious at how David Lammy tried to explain it away? There's been plenty more of that this week, and our friends at the research group More in Common shared some information from a focus group they had on Thursday night, and they asked Labour voters about this, and the words that were coming back were things like outrageous, ridiculous, he's clearly loaded, why are they taking free gifts anyway? And this, I think, has had that elusive thing in politics called cut through. So in the next couple of days, Labour's going to be wanting to talk about all sorts of things: devolution, housing, NHS reform, what's going on with the police. Yvette Cooper gave a big interview today. But, you know, this has cut through to the public, and it's exactly the kind of wrong headline that any party of government just doesn't want.
And for that reason, when he was doing these famous regional political interviews, which have tripped up Rishi Sunak, in fact, and Liz Truss in the past, some of our colleagues from around the UK, he used the language of his critics, questioning who was the boss. And let's just have a little listen to him attempting to reclaim the wheel of the driving force of the government as he spoke to our colleagues from BBC South East.
I'm completely in control and focused, and every day the message from me to the team is exactly the same, which is we have to deliver. We were elected on a big mandate to deliver change. I'm determined that we're going to do that.
So, Laura, that's quite a brief snippet, but there's been a lot more else happening, hasn't there? Because there's been the Sue Gray leaks. People leaked her pay to the BBC's Chris Mason and Henry Zeffman, and that implies there's a lack of discipline in Number 10.
I think that's right, and it is very surprising that at this early stage in a government, they're only 10 weeks in. At this early stage, there's already a level of unhappiness on display. There's already a level of leaking that might be more normal with a government that's sort of, halfway through. You've already heard what should be a jubilant Prime Minister, completely at the top of his game, saying, yes, I am in control. And there's nothing that says, oh, you're not actually really quite on top of things, than saying, oh, I am. This already feels like a government that is having a tough time and has been in charge for a while. The other thing about this, which I'm hearing this sort of faint whisper in Labour circles, and to me, actually, this is really the really interesting growing question, is there's real alarm bells ringing among some people who are part of this new operation, and also some people who are watching on, people like Harriet Harman, other veterans of the party, people who've been around the block, and they're looking at this and kind of whispering a bit to themselves and to each other, and occasionally to people who do my kind of job. And the question is this, and there's a creeping doubt about it, is they won this huge majority, but actually, are they going to be very good at this? Is Keir Starmer really going to be able to run an effective government? Is he really going to turn out to be a very good Prime Minister? And you can just sense, as the Labour tribes are coming together for this conference, that question mark is being held in many people's minds, and the sort of jubilation among their ranks on that morning of the 5th of July, that big event at the Tate Modern on the banks of the Thames. Here we go, here's the bright morning, on we go to glory. There's a real doubt setting in about whether or not this is actually going to turn out to be an administration that can govern with confidence and can govern convincingly, and that they actually know what they're doing. And some people's answer to that right now is not just, I'm not sure, but it doesn't look like it.
Because here's the case for what they have been doing. After the riots, they used the experience of the PM, who had been the DPP, because obviously being the BBC, we love a series of letters that confuse everyone. So he brought in a series of wildly serious sentencing with the police arresting people, and that was seen to have been a swift crackdown on social unrest. Then they've sorted out a series of strikes in the public sector, the train drivers, the doctors, and also other problems that were going on for slowing the country down. Now, there's noises off about that, but that's not the same as being criticised for taking a box to watch Arsenal. And also, of course, what's unfair, say, supporters of Sir Keir, is that what happened to him declaring gifts is not at all comparable to breaking the law. Rishi Sunak was fined by the police twice. Boris Johnson was found to have lied to Parliament by a committee of his peers and was disgraced in the eyes of the country. These things are not the same. But of course, if they're not the same, why on earth are they distracting from what could be said to be, 1, I sorted out social unrest, 2, I've ended the strikes. Yes, there's an argument over if I've paid too much. That's what politics is. But instead, there's loads of arguments about glasses, dresses, tickets, schmickets.
I think that's right. And there is definitely a sense, when you talk to ministers about this, there is a bit of a sense of indignation.
It's unfair.
Yeah, that it's unfair. One of them said to me, the headlines are all the same size. The headlines about somebody's frock is the same size as the headline was about Boris Johnson spending tens and tens and tens of thousands of pounds doing the flat up in Downing Street, and also never opening up about who was really paying it. These are apples and pears. except that they talk to the same thing, which is that members of the public look at it and think, well, hang on a minute, why are you getting stuff that I don't? And I think this is also where the problem comes in for Keir Starmer, because he and his colleagues very carefully and very successfully crafted a narrative around Tory sleaze, accusations of dodgy cash, accusations of doing favour for their mates. That has meant that they are being held to a very high standard. And if you like, this might sound a bit pompous, but I suppose they put morality on the table. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And therefore they're being judged in a sort of moral way. And I think there is actually a bit of a blind spot. It was described to me a few times by people this week about around Starmer's team. There is a bit of a blind spot because they are, in the words of one senior figure in the party said to me, they are convinced they're doing God's work.
Wow.
Which, you know, and that was said to me in quite a sort of acid way. Now, this is somebody who backs them, somebody who's an important figure in the Labour movement said this to me. But they sort of suggested because Starmer's team are so sure that they are doing the right thing and they've worked so hard to get there, there's this kind of, well, we can't be baddies because we're not baddies, because we made the Tories baddies so successfully and everybody agreed at the end, which of course everybody didn't, but the country, a vast majority of people agreed that the Tories were well past their sell-by date. And there's a sense that somehow they're not that good at looking in the mirror, and anything to do with money in politics can be absolutely toxic. It doesn't really necessarily matter even what the intention was, but it can prove absolutely toxic. And especially at a time when people are still in their millions struggling to pay the bills, especially when the biggest, most standout thing the government's done so far is actually decide to take winter fuel allowance away from the vast majority of pensioners. You know, our inbox is full of those kinds of emails from people saying, why did they think they should get any free stuff at all?
Yeah. I mean,
and I think that it's a sort of failure to see that is problematic for them.
We're going to move on from this, and I think newscasters who love the Labour Party will want me to say two words: Liz Truss. Inevitably, this may be a bad beginning, but it's not a 49-day catastrophe that takes the country onto Skid Row, is it? And the thing you know, you said apples and pears. It's just the way, there's a rule of perception, isn't there? That's what we're... Yeah.
There is, and maybe we should have said apples and lettuces. But you know, the perception of this is not good, and we will only see in time. Look, is this a kind of early wobble? And actually, they get a grip of what's going on. They move on. They'll have difficult days on all sorts of things that are much more important. You know, what is Rachel Reeves going to put forward at the budget? How on earth are they going to get the economy going? What are they going to do to get people building houses? What are they going to do about this very long list of problems that the country faces that we've talked so much about over recent months?
Okay.
It may well be that people in time go, it was a wobble. They then realised actually they had to tighten things up. But in the words of a party veteran said to me yesterday, these unforced errors and missteps are very, very alarming. And they went on to say, look, for God's sake, we've just nationalised the railways, and yet this has been allowed to become the story. And, you know, someone else who said it's completely breathtaking that Number of 10 have allowed them to get themselves into this position, to allow a story to run for 7 days, and then on the Friday night put out something that is only a sort of partial fix, if it needs a fix, to try to move on. But, you know, in Number 10, people around Starmer think the substance of the conference will sweep these stories away. They're hoping that they will be proved right. We'll have to see.
OK, so we will move on to some policy areas. One of them is the budget, as you've discussed, and the criticism that's come from some business leaders that the doom message has been very successful at driving doom into the public's message box. And in fact, I spoke to entrepreneur Luke Johnson, who said that this is directly responsible for a fall in confidence. It's not easy to be confident about the economy and sell it around the world if the people who run it say it's a pile of spanners. And also, he doesn't like the plan to encourage more working from home. He thinks you've got to, like Amazon did, if you want growth, you're not going to get it by everyone being at home. Obviously, that's not the Labour policy. But let's just have a listen to Luke Johnson, who's one of those entrepreneurs, talking about policy now, looking ahead to the October the 30th budget.
What I'm not in favour of is the idea that the government are going to say that people, for example, can insist upon working from home, and that there's law to back them up on this. I don't think that's right. I think it should be a negotiated thing between the employer and the employee.
Do you think much will come out about the budget? Let's just say about Luke Johnson, sensible people will disagree about how much hybrid working there should be, so we're just having a policy discussion. Will there be much revealed about the budget? Will there be much policy discussion?
I'm not sure there's going to be much revealed about the budget, but there will be a big speech from Rachel Reeves. You know, the Chancellor's speech is a very important set piece of any party conference. There's lots of pressure on her, as well as there's big pressure on Keir Starmer to come out, you know, all guns blazing and really, really terribly mix my metaphors, knock it out the park this week on the platform. But there is likely to be behind the scenes, as there has been, quite a lot of vigorous discussion over how far their reforms to working practices should go. So things exactly like flexible working, things like the so-called right to switch off, where, you know, you can say, oh, I'm not going to read my emails when I'm not in the office. Things like, at what point do new employment rights actually kick in? So Angela Rayner used to say, oh, they'll start on day one. But now there's a discussion between the unions, the Treasury, the Business Department and Angela Rayner's team about when to bring in the new employment rights that they want to start off with. And there's no decision on that, and it's one of the things that's a bit tricky behind the scenes. But it's interesting to hear Luke Johnson saying that, because there are people inside the Labour camp who also do worry about the doom and gloom being a bit overdone. And there's been some, you know, prominent economists talking about this week to our colleagues today on the Today programme at Radio 4 this week, saying, look, there is a cost to talking the economy down. Politically, they're trying to set the expectation of the public about how quickly there's going to be a sort of feel-good factor, or they hope to create a feel-good factor in the country. But from an economic and a business point of view, there's a risk. There's definitely a risk. And people have said this to me. People have said, oh, I've said to Number 10 they need to cheer up a bit because it's putting business people off coming to the UK, when getting the economy growing is meant to be top of the list.
OK, so we're going to move on to another conference. And here's just the bookend of it. Did the public punish the Conservative Party? Yes, they did. Did Labour win a historic victory? Yes, it did. Has it had a few rocky days starting in government? Yes, it has. And one of the other big takeaways from the 2024 July election was what happened to reform. And guess what? They've hoofed up again to Birmingham to have their conference. Nigel Farage took to the stage with a pair of glasses, mocking Keir Starmer, saying, I bought these myself. And then he admitted that his party had been unprofessional and needed all these changes. And let's just have a listen to Nigel Farage at the Reform Party conference in Birmingham.
We had the teenage tantrums, which were those that caused us harm in the general election. But we're now at a different point. The party is an adult. And this weekend is when Reform UK comes of age.
Laura, another speech by one of our longest standing politicians. A lot of people have left the stage, and wherever newscasters think about Nigel Farage, he's been around a long time, changing what happens.
He has been, and he certainly has been a change maker. I mean, he's somebody who certainly encourages very different responses in people. Some people cannot stand him. Some people think he's the only politician who's brave enough to say what they really think. And newscasters, I'm sure, of all shades in between. But there's no doubt whatsoever that he's had a huge impact, particularly on the Tory party. Yeah. But there's an interesting argument about, you know, whether or not if Nigel Farage hadn't existed, would we have ended up having a European referendum? Quite possibly not. If then, therefore, all the events that flowed from that. But it's interesting to hear him then say his ambition is very, very high for reform. You know, he is determined, and they are determined as an outfit, to grow to become a bigger and bigger and bigger force. Now they're sort of, oh, we're the real opposition now, or we could be the real opposition. At this stage, that is not a claim that you can take seriously because of their size and their scale. But they have MPs in Parliament now. You know, if you'd gone back a few years, you would have thought that was completely unlikely. You know, UKIP sort of had one MP here and one MP there, normally through by-elections. And they do believe that they're in a different phase. And Labour's very aware of that too. You know, Labour lost lots and lots of votes to the Reform Party as well. And they are very conscious of the challenge from that party and their appeal to people who look at politics, who look at politicians with cynicism, who look at politicians with, you know, real disaffection. And I have to say, one of the things that one minister said to me in frustration about, you know, Frockgate and Freebiegate is that it contributes to the sense of cynicism that they have publicly vowed to try to get rid of. You know, we heard Keir Starmer so many times say during the campaign, we've got to return politics to the service of the people. People must be able to believe once again that politics can be a force for good. Nigel Farage has made huge inroads because millions of people don't feel that way. And to neatly go all the way around to where we began, the saga over donations and then distress inside Downing Street with briefing against different staff factions, those are exactly the kinds of things that make lots of newscasters and people watching and listening to the news or reading the headlines and just think, you know what a bunch. I don't want anything to do with them. Politics doesn't work. Can I take my vote elsewhere or not vote at all?
So, party conference season, we've seen the tails wagging at the Reform conference. Also, of course, the Lib Dems, Ed Davey, arrived on a jet ski. It's quite easy to be the Lib Dems and Reform. Reform would say they'd like the same number of MPs, of course, 72. And it's quite hard to be Labour, and it's going to be quite hard to pull off a confident Tory conference as well. But obviously we're not here to talk about it, but we remind newscasters that if you've heard things about the party you love, the party of government, you're going to hear all this again as everyone assembles for the Conservative conference. So we know that we're putting under the focus Labour, and guess what's coming? This extraordinary basket case of politics which is heading in the way of the Conservative Party. Punished at the polls, it's going to be their turn.
Yeah, well, it will, and that will be a very, very, very different kind of gathering. Just also in terms of scale, like the Labour conference this year is absolutely enormous. And the
people want to be there.
People want to be there, and it's always a very good barometer of what's going on in politics is how many people are at the conference, how many people who've got nothing to do with the party turn up. So last year's Labour conference was massive because there was a real sense among the business community and, you know, charities and NGOs and all sorts of campaigners. The sense was that Labour was on the way back to power. And therefore it was worthwhile for all these people and hangers-on, as well as, you know, I was going to say journalists as hangers-on, an outrageous suggestion, but it was very well worthwhile, people, you know, buying into the conference, because it costs a fortune for businesses and other people to, you know, have a stand in the halls or to be here at all. And the Tory conference last year already felt like it was sort of, you know, thinning out a bit. This year, I think the contrast will be even greater, but it's always been, you know, quite a barometer for me for the really big picture. So when conferences looking a bit sad and sparse and people are sort of looking at their shoes, or, you know, party staff are frantically trying to move the audience to the front of the auditorium so that the camera shots don't look like there's no one there and the seats are empty, or when there's genuinely standing room only or queues to see speeches and the bars are all crammed and people are all delighted, then you think that that's a party whose you know, star is on the rise. So this year will be very different for the Labour Party, and it will be very different for the Conservatives. And but I'll be able to tell you tomorrow, and then next Sunday I'll be able to maybe I'll be able to do, I don't know, do a head count. Yeah.
You can count the number of feet and divide by 2. Laura, what's on tomorrow on the TV?
So we're talking to Angela Rayner in the morning, which is really interesting. It's the first time she's ever done the Sunday morning interview with us since our show has been on air. So that is interesting in and of itself. So she'll be with us tomorrow morning, and she's one of the people who's been caught up in, you know, taking freebies. So we'll see what she has to say about that. And I will also give a completely shameless plug for an interview that I recorded yesterday with a couple who you might remember us talking about. So Evgenia Karamarza, who's the wife of a Russian opposition politician, spoke to us on the programme a couple of times over the years, and I think we talked about it on Newscast, campaigning for her husband Vladimir's release. He was a political prisoner who was locked up by Vladimir Putin. He was then one of the prisoners who was released in the prisoner exchange at the beginning of August. Hugely dramatic event. 16 Russian political prisoners were freed, 8 Russians on the other side, including one of Putin's assassins, were exchanged and went back to Russia. So it was a huge story, a real kind of sensational story in the summer. And I'm pleased to say we were able to do the first joint interview with the couple yesterday, since they've been reunited, and hearing about the drama of his release, and also talking to her about when she knew that he was going to be freed, and hearing her children talked to him on the phone once he was free, and how they were reunited as a family was incredibly moving, and we'll be playing that interview tomorrow. And I think, podcasters, there will be a full special episode of the whole interview, so I will shamelessly plug it because it's very emotional. I found it incredibly moving and really well worth listening. Who have you got tomorrow?
Well, we have, on the politics, we'll have the Education Secretary also addressing the interview with Luke Johnson, from which we gave a little snippet, Don't Talk the Economy Down. She'll be reacting to that. We're also, in lifestyle news, hearing about the shock that's been caused to some pub drinkers from people queuing in single file at the bar instead of approaching the bar in a sense of slightly stressful crush without knowing who's going to be served next, which is the British way.
Happening?
It's been happening in Ambleside. In the pub there's put up a sign saying, please approach the bar. Do not come in single file to our bar to be served. That's the talking point that has the nation talking, Laura.
Well, it's got me wondering now.
Newscast from the BBC.